The presentation that we've got today is broken into two components. One is this evolution of drug testing or contractor screening, and that's really going to kind of form the framework of the second part of this presentation, which are the results of the Disa owner survey for 2019. And I say 2019, we started conducting this survey nearly a year ago, and we've carried that through the end of 2018 and into 2019, and now we've got these results. So with that, I will dive in, and again, some of these slides will be redundant, but you'll have the context behind it. So the evolution of employee screening, just as an example, I started with Disa back in 2002, but we are going to rewind all the way to 1989 with the introduction of DOT, or Department of Transportation, which were the federal regulations guiding drug and alcohol testing for very specific agencies. We've got a truck here, so the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, but there are a number of DOT agencies that are regulated for drug and alcohol testing. And in 1989, what this did was this set a baseline for all the parameters of a drug testing program. Now, Department of Transportation is focused on specific companies and more specifically employee job functions. However, non-federally regulated companies and employees were able to use this as a guide to develop corporate programs. The DOT drug testing program consisted of a 5-panel urinalysis drug test. In different cases, breath alcohol testing was allowed and conducted. The drugs that were being tested for in this 5-panel were marijuana, cocaine, opioids, amphetamines, and PCP. And you can see that there were a variety of required tests that would occur. Now, fast forward to 1992 with contractor compliance. This originally started downstream with refineries and petrochem sites that essentially had varying degrees of drug and alcohol testing programs for their contractor companies. And the challenge was that although these owners had specific policies, they did not have visibility into the contractor company and, more importantly, the individual contractor employees' status or compliance to those policy requirements. And so a program was developed to help owners, one, create standardization across the contractor companies that were coming on their site, but two, more importantly, create a tracking mechanism so there was that transparency where an owner site could very quickly identify that the company and, more importantly, the individual contractor employee were in compliance with the appropriate drug and alcohol testing requirements. This program consisted of a 10-panel urinalysis test. So again, 5 additional drugs were added. These were predominantly pharmaceutical-based drugs, which can be both legally and legitimately used as well as illicitly abused. Some key differences: this is not federally regulated. So this falls outside of DOT testing, as evidenced by the additional drugs beyond the 5-panel. And originally in '92, this was focused on downstream facilities, refineries, petrochemical sites, as an example. Now, fast forward all the way to 2006, and I put this in here because although drug testing has had a lot of evolution, the background screening industry and tracking compliance and implementing these programs has also evolved significantly. Post 9/11, there were a number of government initiatives that were at least started, and so in 2006, the energy sector really got together and, as a best practice, started to develop a program very similar to the drug testing concept, where there was a standardized group of products. There was grading and evaluating tied to a specific policy, and then there were employer-specific or site-specific cut scores. I always reference drug testing and say that, it's fairly easy because there's a positive or a negative, with background checks, there's a number of products and there's a number of reports or records that could be returned, and some of those may violate the policy that's been set forth by that employer or the owner. Now, 2006, this program was developed within the energy industry, and this preceded the 2007 implementation by the government and by Congress implementing what's known today as CFATS, the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards. The focus here was to protect chemical facilities from terrorist attacks, and this program was regulated by Department of Homeland Security. Now, the program had specific guidelines that spoke to validating identity, performing a criminal history check, and really kind of tying into Patriot Act searches. So again, these databases that had been developed that could potentially identify known terrorists. And so what was exciting was the industry had already implemented a program that met the requirements of CFATS, but also went beyond the CFATS regulation because it was covering sites that weren't necessarily identified under the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standard. Now, in 2008, hair testing started to be implemented for contractor companies going on site at facilities. Originally, this started downstream with refineries and petrochem sites, but very quickly moved upstream to exploration and production, initially going offshore in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, this 5-panel hair test was required in addition to urinalysis testing. With any methodology, there are always pros and cons. And so when you combine the pros, when you combine the two programs, you get the pros of both of these methodologies. The only con is you're performing 2 tests on that individual. Now, with hair testing, a couple of key call-outs. This has a very long detection window. And so when you think about urinalysis testing, it's near-term or short-term detection, measuring from 1 day up to, approximately 7 days, depending on the drug type. Well, with hair testing, once that hair has grown out past the scalp, so call it a week to 2 weeks, at that point, the collection can be made, and the hair can measure up to 90 days of usage. And so it's like a little tape recorder where that drug metabolite is getting captured in the hair. Another key call out on this methodology is that it's 100% observed collection. So again, that collection can be done minimizing any games, adulterants, et cetera, that could be applied where you oftentimes see those games being played with urinalysis testing. Now in 2010, we started to see the expansion of that 10-panel urinalysis test that I talked about to start including additional opioids. So although we hear about the opioid epidemic today, it's constantly on the news. It's a huge concern across the country. The reality is this crisis started showing up in the employee screening world a decade ago. And so by expanding the panel to include additional opioids, like hydrocodone as an example, it created better detection that drug usage was occurring, and also a better deterrent to, again, try and avoid any risk being presented on site. You can see some scary stats. Unfortunately, injured workers prescribed even one opioid have a 4 times greater claim cost. Prescription drugs account for 19% of workers' comp costs, and 7 million Americans reported the misuse of prescription drugs. I mean, these are staggering numbers, and again, they unfortunately only continue to get worse and more frightening. So, the education, the actual implementation of these programs is critical. Jump to 2012, and some of you may remember this. It was quite scary. Drug paraphernalia was being found. All of the signs of an impaired employee were being exhibited. However, when the drug test was submitted, it was coming back negative. And so the employer was confident that this individual was impaired, however, the tests were not detecting it. And that's because synthetic drugs had hit the market. And essentially there were two buckets of synthetic drug types. One was synthetic THC, or fake marijuana, and the other one was what we referred to as synthetic cocaine, or bath salts, which had, both had these significantly more heightened effects than the drugs they were imitating. They were chemical compounds. There were a number of different versions of this drug. So initially, laboratories were challenged to even detect it. And then very quickly, through research and development, they started developing the means to detect these highly utilized synthetic drugs. Now, we saw positivity rates go from 0 to rocket ship rates, double, triple, quadruple what we saw with the traditional drugs of abuse. But then over the course of a few more years, we saw a steep decline for a number of reasons. One, the government did make a number of these compounds illegal, and so that started to reduce the supply of these fake or synthetic drug types. Unfortunately, also, we saw the rise of the legalization of marijuana. And so the supply is going down and the costs are going up on the synthetic. The testing is focused on the synthetic. And there are a number of laws, whether it was for medical or recreational use, that was allowing the drug. So again, for those reasons, this was more of a fad from 2012 to about 2015, where we saw the positivity rates peak. Now, most recently in 2015, we've seen the introduction of oral fluid testing, and this originally was introduced as what we refer to as an 11-panel. So it's your traditional 10-panel drugs plus the synthetic THC. We saw this replace urine because oral fluid is also that near-term or short-term detection window methodology. And we've seen it used in addition to hair testing, very similar to the combination of urinalysis and hair testing. Benefits of this, one of the biggest ones with oral fluid testing is it's 100% observed collection. So very similar to hair testing in that you can minimize the amount of games being played to adulterate or substitute the sample. And I think this was also a focus, and we're seeing this rise on attempts to detect recent usage or impairment. Although oral fluid will detect recent usage, it goes beyond and can detect up to 2 to 3 days of use. So it's not necessarily speaking directly to impairment, but this was absolutely focused on looking at that short-term window. This breaks out testing data, and again, this is Disa specific. We have this available on our website with regards to a return on investment calculator based on number of employees, what the potential cost of drug abusers are to your organization. But you can see, just as an example with pre-employment, the differences between 5-panel urine, expanding it to a 10-panel urine test, changing or adding the 5-panel hair test, and then you can see the 11-panel oral fluid test. Another key call out is in all cases, except for hair testing, marijuana has been and continues to be the #1 drug of choice, whereas interestingly enough, with hair testing, cocaine is the #1 drug of choice. And this is because cocaine is a water-soluble drug, so it metabolizes very quickly and flushes out of your system with traditional tests like urine or oral fluid. With hair testing, it's that little tape recorder where that drug metabolite's getting trapped in the cortex of the hair. And for those reasons, cocaine, unfortunately, is showing up as that #1 drug. Few last call-outs with regards to the methodologies. Obviously, as employers, as owners, you want to review and implement the right types of testing for your business. the vast majority of people on the phone are really hypersensitive to the safety-sensitive job functions. However, I don't want to blur the lines with safety-sensitive being unique to DOT. Safety-sensitive obviously expands well beyond the Department of Transportation, but calling out the difference between safety-sensitive and non-safety-sensitive and whether or not that changes the policy. Understanding the different methodologies that are available, urinalysis, hair, oral fluid, the expanded panels, and then the test purposes and additional programs that tie to that. One thing I would like to point out on this slide, medical disclosures. So there are a number of white papers and presentations that have been given specific to medical disclosures. And essentially one of the challenges with employers is that when somebody legitimately has a substance in their system, and so ultimately that test result is reported out as negative, there still may be a safety risk or an impairment risk. And medical disclosures and medical policies help protect the employers, but also the employees from the potential of believing they're doing the right thing and legally doing the right thing, but still having that impairment and that safety risk on site. I referenced our positivity rate or return on investment calculator. You can visit that at the Disa.com website. But again, punch in your number of employees. It will apply the positivity rates that we have, plus the assumed cost of a drug abuser. Oftentimes we throw out a stat of $7,000, which is the cost of one drug abuser to an employer. Now the reality is with safety and security sensitive employees and job functions, the damages can be significantly higher. And so we've put together an estimate in the safety-sensitive environment of $35,000. And so you can see how significantly these individuals can impact your business on a day-to-day basis. Now, I wanted to run through that evolution because it really helps to shape a lot of the questions that we were asking our owners. A number of these were developed by owners that we have worked with and we have talked to where they are interested to find out if there are best practices, if there are trends, what their peers are doing. So with that, I'll walk through these slides. And one thing to say is at the end of this, we will follow up with, calls. We'll have this recorded, but certainly if you have questions, please submit those and we will, again, follow up with calls and in writing. So the goal of the survey was to identify best practices throughout safety-sensitive industries. The survey covers best practices and trends for drug testing, background screening, badging systems, and portal companies or portal processes. The survey methodology conducted we conducted more than 60 surveys with owner-operators across the oil and gas and energy markets that perform drug testing. The incentive for the owners to participate was to get a high-level report back that compares their facilities' best practices in the industry. And so we were keeping the results confidential, but wrapping them up statistically to show if you fell within this threshold or if you answered yes versus no, how does that stack up to the remainder of the surveys? Another keynote, 80% of the owners that participated are currently using Disa Global Solutions in some capacity. So we had a lot of insight with regards to the specifics of their policies and procedures, and they definitely help shape a number of the questions that were asked throughout this survey. Now, we are continuing this survey on an ongoing basis, so we will continue to circulate an annual document and just continue to expand the database of answers and the pool of people. So if you'd like to participate, we can absolutely get you in touch with a representative to walk you through the questions at your convenience. So as far as owner trends, first question we asked are you concerned about we asked, have you experienced any theft, violence, or drug-related activity in the past 12 months? 42% of the respondents said yes. And specifically, what kind of activity? 70% had experienced on-site drug-related activity, 74% on-site theft, and then a much smaller percentage, 17%, experienced the on-site violence. Next question we asked was, are you concerned about increased legal marijuana use by contractors? This one surprised me. 61% said no. And then we followed up with a similar question with regards to are they concerned with synthetic THC? And again, nearly 60% answered no. Now, with all of the changing laws and trends across the country, it's something that we're constantly talking about with, trade shows and forums and with our clients directly. So this one, like I said, was surprising. We said, how are you educating the workforce that legal marijuana is still prohibited? And you can see there, staggering 44% said we are not. Now, the rest are addressing it via safety meetings or traditional methods like email and letters going out to their workforce. But again, legal marijuana being prohibited, and 44% of the survey respondents are not having that discussion at all. Similar conversation was had about opioids. Again, the opioid epidemic. So are there concerns regarding the opioid epidemic at your facility? And very similarly to marijuana, 61% said no. And then when we asked, do you use medical acknowledgement forms for safety-sensitive positions? 70% said no. And like I touched on earlier, this is one of those opportunities because there is such a concern with regards to legal impairment that these medical acknowledgement forms and policies seem to become more critical. So what are owners testing? So which drug testing methodologies do you use? 93% stated that they use urinalysis, which I've always affectionately called the gold standard. 42% use hair testing. And one thing to call out here is, in all cases, hair testing was in addition to either urinalysis or oral fluid. And you can see 75% were doing alcohol testing. Where we saw companies not consistently performing alcohol testing was upstream with exploration and production fields. And then we asked an open-ended question, is there anything else you'd like to start screening for? And 16% responded with hair testing. So why are owners testing? What concerns you most with employees and screening? 26% said compliance. 21% had concerns about the administrative burden, 18% costs. So again, managing the program was a concern, but also a reason. What trends are you seeing increasing at your site or location? The labor pool is consistent throughout a number of the questions we asked, and so lack of labor pool came through on 40% of the respondents. Then prescription abuse, drug-related activity. Other was kind of this potpourri of a number of smaller answers, but you can see alcohol abuse and then synthetics use at 7%. So 4 of the top 5 trends increasing at their sites were related to drug and alcohol abuse. Have you seen a decrease in safety-related incidents since the inception of a drug testing program? 71% of owners saw a reduction in safety-related incidents. We further asked, have you seen a decrease in safety-related incidents since the inception of a consortium or a tracking solution? Those 71%, 52% of the owners also saw an additional reduction because of the implementation of a consortium. So what consortium innovation do you most benefit from? Real-time access was number one with 29%, reciprocity at 24%. So that's allowing an employee to go from contractor to contractor, but also more importantly, that contractor going from owner site to owner site. And then you've got these additional program benefits, the increased testing of very specific drugs and methodologies, the ease of use, the tracking component. How is the consortium most improved worker safety and health? And again, back to that labor pool. Better quality workforce came up 29% of the time. Fewer incidents, standard program, increased testing, easy to track. So again, by having something standardized and transparent, the survey respondents believed that they were getting this better labor pool. Consortium owners that saw a decrease in safety incidents were asked to elaborate why. And again, goes back to the better quality of workforce at 42%, believe that contributed to a safer facility at 26%, and then standardization rounded out that top three. So how are owners testing? Is your decision making centralized or decentralized? So a number of the facilities that we talk to have sister facilities. So 75% of the decision making was centralized. Then we asked, do you mandate one drug testing provider or accept multiple? 71% mandate one provider, whereas you can see 22% accept multiple, and then 7% don't mandate any specific providers. They just had general policy requirements. Why do you mandate one provider? 90% said real-time tracking, 90% said standardized requirements, ease of administration was another top one, and then you can see a lot of the benefits that come out of it, the increased safety, the reciprocity, decreasing risk. So 71% of owners mandate a single provider for drug testing, and all those reasons are really wrapped around the standardization, tracking, and transparency. We then asked, do you share contractor compliance information with your peers? 55% said yes. Of that group, is your contractor screening and compliance standardized across all of your sites? And 76% said yes, which seems consistent with the fact that there was a high percentage that were standardized from a centralized decision-making point. So how do you share your contractor compliance information? 64% utilized Disa, 18% used a safety council. We had portal companies listed there, and one of my favorites at the bottom was the good old boy system. And I can tell you 3% in 2019, I'm getting more comfortable with that number. When I started in 2002, the good old boy system was, probably 93%. So it's a good thing that more and more companies are embracing technology and really kind of leveraging that tracking and transparency. But the good old boy system is still alive and well. So do you integrate with portal companies? 83% of respondents said yes. And then we asked them to go into a little more detail and we said, which portal companies do you integrate with? Overwhelmingly, IS Networld was listed. Safety councils were second. And then Avetta, which formerly PICS, was listed in third. And then there was kind of a potpourri of others. Do you use a badging system? Again, 83% said yes. And then when we asked which badging system do you use, half of them responded with Linnell, and you can see Secure, Not Sure, Infront, Helipass all came up. So again, there's a number of different badging systems on the market. It seemed like Linnell, for at least the owners that we had surveyed, was leading the charge. Which unique identifier do you use in your badging system? This is definitely something that I've seen change over the years. 33% responded with badge ID number. 25% responded with Social Security number. So early days, Social Security number was the number being utilized, probably followed closely by badge ID. Those have now switched. And then you've got, employee IDs or customized numbers or randomized numbers that are being utilized. When are owners testing? So these questions really kind of focus on on-site activity. So do you perform owner-initiated testing? 36% of respondents said yes. And then when do you perform owner-initiated testing? And you can see nearly half of the respondents were somewhat inconsistent. So 44% didn't have a specific time frame or frequency. And just to clarify for the folks in attendance, owner-initiated testing occurs outside of the typical prescribed pre-employment or randomly scheduled testing. So this is something where the site is dictating additional testing needs to occur. Sometimes it's random. Sometimes it's based on a specific event, like drug paraphernalia being found. Do you provide on-site collections for your nested contractors? 79% said no. And so the 21% that are providing on-site collection capabilities, we asked how frequently do you provide them. 57% were daily, and then you can see it became less frequent, really based on need, projects, potentially rotations of schedules. Do you provide on-site testing for contractors? And this question was more specific to any projects, so turnaround, construction, et cetera, and 46% said yes. So we did see an increase when you had the project-specific or a ramp-up in the labor force coming on site. Do you have a location on site to conduct collections, or do you bring in trailers? 67% established an on-site collection area, where 33% brought in trailers. Where on site do you do your testing? And again, you can see a variety of locations, but more often than not, when it was on-site testing provided, there was some specific facility or area that was designated and communicated out to the contractors. Do you offer temporary passes or exemptions? So this is speaking to whether or not an owner will allow someone on site even though they have not met the requirements of their various policies, whether that be drug testing, background checks, et cetera. And so 82% of respondents do offer temporary passes. When we ask, though, who is eligible for a temporary pass, you can see all contractors was listed at 45%, which means over half of the contractors looking for an exception need to have a specific circumstance, like emergency, like escorted, or some other special circumstance. And so then we asked who signs off on temporary passes or exemptions. 43% of the time it's the safety manager, but you can see 24% of the time, 1 out of 4 times, the plant manager or the highest level of that operation is signing off on these temporary passes, which probably speaks to the infrequency of these things occurring. So the next section is on point of collection tests or quick tests. Do you utilize point of collection tests? 45% said yes. And then do you track the results? 85% of those respondents said yes. Have you ever had a false positive on a quick test? 40% had experienced a false positive. So when you think about only 45% of owners using point of collection tests, when they do, 77% of those owners are sending the test off to be lab certified. So they're not fully trusting that point of collection. I usually use the term warm fuzzy, but essentially these point of collection tests are being used oftentimes as a warm fuzzy to expedite whatever the next step in the process is, or potentially help validate, offering an exemption or a temporary pass. So with regards to background screening, we asked, do you require background checks? 64% of the owners said yes. We asked about their cut score, and just as a reminder, a cut score is essentially a way to create that positive or negative similar to drug testing. And so when you select a cut score, what that means is you will allow that number or any of the smaller numbers. So 76% of the survey respondents have a cut score of a level 2, which includes violent misdemeanors. So by having a cut score of a 2, they will accept a 2, a 1, or a 0. A 0 is no records found. Here's some data similar to what I shared on the positivity rates. A key call out here is 87% of the time, and this is 2018 data, the records come back clear. But that means 13% of the time, there's a record found that falls into a misdemeanor or felony category, and then a few times you'll actually see a Patriot Act hit, which is from one of those known terrorist watch list databases. Do you have a renewal time frame for your background checks? 95% of respondents said yes. And how frequently do you renew? Number one answer by a mile was every 2 years. 91% of the respondents basically require that background check be refreshed every 2 years. So last few slides are just the takeaways, and we've covered these recently, but there is a noticeable shift towards multiple testing methodologies to eliminate gaps in drug testing coverage. 42% of owners are using multiple testing methodologies. That's that hair testing being complemented by urinalysis or oral fluid. And then 16% wrote in that they wanted to add hair testing to their program. Communication to employees needs improvement. 70% of respondents aren't using medical acknowledgement forms. 44% aren't communicating the marijuana-related information. So the fact that it may be legal in your state or certain states where travelers may come from or go to, and that is still prohibited at your work site. The concern for legal marijuana and opiates are still low at 40% overall. And again, I call out the traveling workforces that makes this an issue. One, for transparency, but two, being in a state where it's allowed, there's a very real potential that that employee may use, not knowing that it is prohibited when they go to a site in that state or outside of that state. And then very consistent, the lack of quality labor pool, prescription abuse, drug and alcohol abuse, top increasing trends from the owner perspective. 71% of owners mandate a single provider. Most owners share contractor compliance information with their peers. Again, creating some kind of tracking capability and transparency across the industry so you're inclusive of not just owners, contractors, but the contractor employees. 71% of owners saw a reduction in safety-related incidents upon implementing a drug testing program. In addition, 52% of those owners saw a further reduction in safety-related incidents upon implementing a consortium, so that tracking capability. 83% of owners integrate with portal companies. 83% of owners integrate with a badging company. ISNetworld was the overwhelming portal company, and Linnell was 50% for badging companies. 82% of sites offer temporary passes. However, more than half of those are restricted, and several of those are going to the highest level of that location for approval. Point of collection testing is offered for quicker access, but the risk of false positives or false negatives exist. And 45% of owners use those tests, but they're being sent off to the lab in most cases, regardless of the result. And then more owners are implementing background screening. The majority of owners require background checks that are renewed every 2 years and at a cut score of a 2. And then more than 31% of all owners have seen theft-related incidents 30% have seen drug abuse, and 7% have had on-site violence in the past 12 months. So with that, I appreciate everyone's time and patience with us getting the slideshow started and the audio working. Again, if you do have any questions, please submit those, and we will follow up with answers back out to the group. We'll also follow up with calls and make sure that everyone gets this recording for review. Thank you very much for your time.